Commander Vrethok had fought in 11 wars across 4 decades. He had served the Dralith hegemony since he was old enough to hold a weapon, and he had seen every kind of battle the galaxy had to offer. He had watched planets burn. He had watched fleets crumble. He had buried soldiers whose names he still remembered on quiet nights when sleep refused to come. War, to him, was not something to be feared or loved. It was simply the shape of his life, right, and he had made peace with that shape a long time ago. So when the hegemony's war council told him he was being sent as a military liaison to a human warship, he felt nothing at all. Humans were new. They had only discovered faster-than-light travel within the last century, and their presence on the galactic stage was barely a footnote. The hegemony needed allies against the Nivek swarm, a massive and hungry force that consumed everything it touched, and the humans had raised their hand and volunteered. Vrethok thought it was either brave or stupid, and he suspected it was the second one. The ship was called the Carthage. It was small by hegemony standards, barely the size of a light corvette, and it carried a crew of roughly 300. When Vrethok stepped aboard for the first time, he noticed that the corridors were narrow, the lighting was warm instead of the cold blue he was used to, and there was a faint smell in the air that he later learned was coffee. He did not know what coffee was at the time. He would learn. Captain Laura Beckett met him at the airlock. She was a woman of average height with dark hair pulled back tight and eyes that gave away absolutely nothing. She shook his hand, which was a human greeting he had been briefed on, and she said welcome aboard with a voice that was calm and direct and carried no warmth and no coldness. It was simply a voice that stated facts. She introduced him to the senior officers as they walked through the ship. The first was Lieutenant Commander Danny Harlow, the tactical officer. Harlow was a lean man with sharp eyes and a grin that appeared at odd moments, usually when someone was talking about danger. He shook Vrethok's hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong and said he hoped the commander was ready for an interesting time. Vrethok did not know what he meant by that. The second was Chief Engineer Grace Kimura. She was shorter than most of the crew, with dark eyes and calloused hands that were stained with engine grease even during the introduction. She nodded at Vrethok instead of shaking his hand, because her fingers were wrapped around a wrench at the time, and she said something about the port stabilizer being moody today before walking back into the engine room without waiting for a reply. Vrethok found her rude, and he would later find her extraordinary. The third was Pete Calloway, the chief medical officer. Calloway was a quiet man with a gentle face and steady hands. He greeted Vrethok with a polite nod and a few soft words. Of all the humans Vrethok met that first day, Calloway was the one who unsettled him the most, and he could not explain why. There was something behind the man's calm that felt heavy, like a stone sitting at the bottom of a deep lake. Vrethok settled into his quarters and sent his first report to the hegemony that evening. He wrote that the humans were disciplined but unremarkable. Their technology was functional but not impressive. Their ship was small, their crew was modest, and he did not expect them to contribute anything meaningful to the war effort. He recommended that the hegemony treat them as minor support assets, and nothing more. He would spend the rest of his life regretting that report. And the first engagement came 3 weeks later near the Varath Nebula. A Nivek raiding flotilla had been attacking supply convoys in the region, and the Allied fleet moved to intercept. The fleet consisted of 12 hegemony cruisers and the Carthage. Vrethok stood on the human ship's bridge as the enemy signatures appeared on the sensor display, and he watched the crew's reaction with the clinical eye of a veteran observer. He expected hesitation. He expected fear, or at least caution. And these were people who had never faced the Nivek before, and the swarm's reputation alone was enough to make seasoned Dralith officers grip their armrests. But the bridge of the Carthage did not tense. It sharpened. Captain Beckett looked at the sensor data for no more than 4 seconds. Then she began giving orders, and her voice did not change at all. It was the same calm, direct tone she had used to welcome him aboard. She could have been ordering lunch. Or she could have been reading a weather report, but she was steering her ship into a fight, and every single member of her crew responded instantly, without question, without pause. Harlow's fingers moved across the weapons console so fast that Vrethok's eyes could barely track them. The man was smiling. Not with joy, and not with madness, but with something in between. Something that looked almost like recognition, as though combat was a language he had been born speaking. Down in engineering, Kimura was already rerouting power to the forward shields before anyone on the bridge had asked for it. She had read the battle before it started, and she was 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room. The Carthage broke formation. This alarmed Vrethok. In Drelith doctrine, formation was everything. Ships held their positions, supported each other, and advanced as a unified wall. But the Carthage dove beneath the enemy line, fast and sharp. I'd like a blade slipping between ribs, and it struck the Nivek command ship with a volley so precise that the target's shields collapsed in a single burst. The flotilla panicked. Without their command ship coordinating the swarm, the raiders scattered, and the hegemony cruisers picked them apart in minutes. The entire battle lasted 9 minutes. The Carthage took 1 hit to the port side during the dive. A section of the outer hull buckled, and atmosphere began venting from a storage bay. By the time Vrethok turned to ask about damage, Kimura had already sealed the breach. She had patched it with a combination of emergency welding and what appeared to be a section of ventilation duct that she had ripped from a nearby wall with her bare hands. Vrethok stood on the bridge after it was over. The crew was already returning to normal operations. Harlow was reviewing the engagement data. Beckett was making notes on her data pad. Continuing, as though what had just happened was simply the next thing in a long list of things. Vrethok had seen many battles. He had seen bravery and cowardice and everything between. But he had never seen anything quite like this. The battle had been small, the enemy had been disorganized, and the victory had been easy by most standards. But the way the humans had moved through it, the way they had flowed into the violence without resistance and flowed back out again without ceremony, left something sitting in his chest that he could not name. He returned to his quarters that night and opened his report to add a single line at the bottom. "I may have underestimated them." He stared at the words for a long time. Then he closed the file and sat in the dark and listened to the hum of the human ship around him. And he wondered what else he had been wrong about. The weeks after the Verith Nebula engagement were quiet, or at least as quiet as a war allowed. The Allied fleet pushed deeper into contested space, chasing the Nivek back toward their breeding grounds, and the Carthage took on the role of forward scout. It was dangerous work. The scout ship moved ahead of the fleet, alone, scanning for enemy positions and drawing fire so the main force could react. Vrethok had expected the humans to be assigned this role. He had not expected them to volunteer for it. He asked Captain Beckett why she had requested the position. She looked at him with those unreadable eyes and said, "Because someone has to go first, and we are fast enough to survive it." It was not bravery the way Vrethok understood bravery. It was not a boast or a display. It was just a fact, delivered like every other fact she delivered. And she moved on to the next item on her list before he could respond. Vrethok began spending more time among the crew, not because he liked them. He was not sure he did, but there was something about the way they operated that he could not figure out, and it picked at him like a thorn caught under his scales. He was a soldier. He understood soldiers. But these humans kept doing things that did not fit inside the shape of what he knew. And the gap between what he expected and what he observed grew wider every day. Danny Harlow ran combat drills every 48 hours. This was not unusual. What was unusual was what the drills contained. Harlow designed scenarios that were not just difficult, but impossible. He would simulate battles where the ship was outnumbered 10-1, where the weapons systems were offline, where the shields had failed and the hull was breached in 6 places and casualties had reached 70%. And he would stand in the middle of the bridge and watch his team struggle through these nightmares. And he would take notes, and afterward he would gather them together, and they would talk about what went wrong and what could be done differently. Vrethak pulled him aside one afternoon and told him that these drills were pointless. "You are training for scenarios that would result in total destruction," he said. "No ship survives these conditions. You are wasting your crew's energy preparing for death." Harlow leaned against the corridor wall and folded his arms. The grin was there, but it was softer now, and there was something underneath it that Vrethak had not seen before. "Commander," Harlow said, "we don't train for the fights we can win. We train for the ones we are not supposed to survive, because those are the ones that actually happen." Vrethak did not have an answer for that. He walked away thinking about it, and he was still thinking about it 3 days later. Grace Kimura was a different kind of puzzle. The chief engineer spent most of her time in the belly of the ship, surrounded by machines and wires and the constant hum of the reactor. She talked to the engines the way some people talk to pets, with a mix of affection and mild irritation, and she seemed to know what was wrong with the ship before the diagnostic systems did. She kept a notebook, not a data pad, not a digital file, but an actual paper notebook with a cracked leather cover and pages that were yellow at the edges. It was filled with hand-drawn schematics, equations, and notes written in a small, slanted handwriting that Vrethak could barely read even after months of studying the human alphabet. He asked her once why she used paper when every piece of technology on the ship was digital. She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. There was grease on her cheek, and her hair was falling out of its tie, and then she held the notebook against her chest, the way a mother might hold something precious. 3 years ago, she said, I was on a ship called the Fairbanks. We were boarded by raiders. They hit us with an electromagnetic pulse that killed every electronic system on the ship. Everything. Navigation, life support, communications, all of it. We were blind and suffocating and dead in the water. She tapped the notebook with one finger. I rebuilt the navigation array from the notes in this book. By hand. In the dark. It took me 11 hours, and I burned my fingers so badly on the soldering iron that I could not feel them for a week afterward. But I got the ship moving again, and we made it home. She turned back to her work. Paper does not crash, Commander. Paper does not need a power source. Paper survives. Vrethak said nothing. He stood there for a moment, watching her hands move through the machine in front of her. I'm steady and sure, and he thought about what it meant to be a person who planned for the moment when everything fell apart. But it was Pete Calloway who changed something inside him. The medic was the quietest member of the senior staff. He did his work with a gentle efficiency that Vrethak respected, and he never raised his voice, and he never complained, and he never asked for anything he did not need. In meetings, he spoke only when spoken to, and his words were always careful and precise, like a surgeon placing stitches. One evening, Vrethak was walking through the lower decks when he passed the open door of the medbay. The lights were dim. Calloway was sitting alone at his desk, and in front of him were small laminated cards spread out in neat rows. Vrethak stopped in the doorway and looked. The cards had faces on them, human faces. Below each face was a name and 2 dates. These are the ones I could not save, Calloway said without looking up. His voice was steady, but there was a weight in it that pressed against the walls of the room. Every patient I have lost, every person who died on my table or in my arms or in a corridor while I was trying to reach them. I keep their faces with me so that I never forget what the cost looks like. Vrethak stood very still. Among the Drelith, death in war was honored with silence and ritual. You mourned, and then you released the dead. because carrying them would slow you down. It was practical. It was clean. It was the way things had been done for centuries. But Calloway was not releasing anyone. He was holding them, all of them, deliberately, permanently. He was choosing to carry that weight every single day, and it was not because he was weak or sentimental. It was because he believed he owed them that. "Does it not break you?" Vrethak asked quietly. Calloway looked up. His eyes were dry, but they were old, much older than the rest of his face. "Every single day," he said. "And every single day I get up and do it again. Because the moment I stop feeling it is the moment I stop being good enough to save the next one." Vrethak left the med bay and walked back to his quarters in silence. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the wall and felt something shifting inside him, slow and deep, like a continent moving. He opened his report to the hegemony and began writing. The words came slowly, and because what he was trying to describe did not have a shape in his language. "The humans do not fight the way we do," he wrote. "They do not experience war the way any species I have studied does. They carry it with them. Not just the victories and the tactics, but the pain, the loss, the faces of the dead. They hold on to everything, and instead of being crushed by the weight, they use it. They turn their grief into fuel. They turn their scars into armor. It's extended observation. I believe there is extended observation. I believe there is something here that the hegemony needs to understand before it is too late." He sent the report and turned off the light and lay in the dark, listening to the ship breathe around him. Somewhere above him, Danny Harlow was running another impossible drill. Somewhere below him, Sir Grace Kimura was talking to an engine. Somewhere across the corridor, Pete Calloway was sitting with his cards. And Vrethak, for the first time in 40 years of war, felt like he was the one who had something to learn. The distress call came in at 3 in the morning, ship time. Moorhaven Station, a civilian relay outpost deep in Allied territory, was under attack. The Nivek had hit it with a force 3 times the size that intelligence had predicted, and the station's light defenses were already failing. Over 40,000 civilians were on board, families, children, people who had never held a weapon in their lives. Vrethak was pulled from sleep by the alarm. By the time he reached the bridge, the crew was already at their stations, and Captain Beckett was standing at the center console with her hands flat on the surface, reading the incoming data. The numbers were terrible. The Nivek had brought a full assault swarm, out over 200 combat units, supported by breacher ships and a carrier-class high vessel. Against them, there were only 4 Allied ships within response range, 2 Drelith hegemony frigates, 1 Tassari patrol cruiser, and the Carthage. The main fleet was 6 hours away. Vrethak looked at the display and felt something cold settle in his chest. He had been in unwinnable battles before. He knew what they looked like, and this one looked like death. Captain Beckett closed her eyes. The Vrethak watched her, and for 1 second, just one, he saw something move across her face. It was not fear. It was something quieter than fear, something deeper. It was the weight of what she was about to decide. Then she opened her eyes, and whatever had been there was gone. In its place was something solid and unmovable, like a wall built in a single breath. "All hands to battle stations," she said. "We are going to Moorhaven." The hegemony frigate captains argued. Vrethak listened to their voices over the communications channel, tight with stress, and he understood their position. The math did not work. 4 ships against 200 was not a battle. It was a funeral. Captain Beckett listened to every objection. Then she spoke, and her voice was not loud, but it filled every corner of the bridge. "There are 40,000 people on that station," she said. "Families. They have 6 hours before help arrives, and they will not last 6 minutes without us. I am taking my ship to Moorhaven. You can come with me or you can stay here and explain to the War Council why you watched civilians die from a safe distance." The channel was silent for 5 seconds. Then the hegemony captains confirmed they would follow. The Carthage arrived at Moorhaven 22 minutes later, and the situation was worse than the data had suggested. The station's outer ring was already breached. Nivek boarding pods were attached to the hull like parasites, and the swarm was circling the station in layers, tightening like a fist. What followed was 4 hours and 11 minutes of the most brutal, desperate, and extraordinary combat that Vrethak had ever witnessed in his life. Captain Beckett placed the Carthage between the station and the thickest concentration of enemy forces. She used her own ship as a shield, an absorbing fire that would have torn through the station's thin civilian hull. The Carthage shook with every impact. Alarms screamed, metal groaned, but Beckett held position and did not move. Danny Harlow became something that Vrethak did not have a word for. The tactical officer sat at his console, and his hands moved, and his eyes moved, and he found patterns in the swarm that no one else could see. The Nivek fought in waves, coordinated by chemical signals from the hive carrier, and Harlow read those signals like a language. He predicted their movements seconds before they happened. He placed shots in gaps that should not have existed. He fired solutions born not from mathematics or training, but from something raw and instinctive, something that lived in the space between thinking and knowing, and every shot landed where it needed to land. When the weapon systems began failing, he rerouted targeting through backup channels that were never designed for combat use. When the backup channels failed, he switched to manual firing and did not miss. Down in engineering, Grace Kimura fought her own war. The ship was dying around her. Power conduits ruptured. Coolant lines burst. The reactor temperature climbed toward critical, and every system on the ship was screaming for attention at the same time. She did not panic. She moved through the chaos like water flowing through broken rock, finding the path, always finding the path. She rerouted the water recycling system to cool the reactor when the primary coolant failed. She bridged a severed power line using components ripped from the mess hall's refrigeration unit. At one point, a plasma conduit blew open in the corridor behind her, filling the passage with superheated gas, and she held a jury-rigged connection in place with her bare hands for 20 minutes while the fire burned at her back. Because if she let go, the ship would lose power and everyone would die. And she did not let go. Pete Calloway turned the medbay into something that defied explanation. The wounded came in waves, carried and dragged, and sometimes crawling through the doors, and Calloway received every single one of them with the same steady hands and the same quiet voice. He triaged injuries that Drelith field medics would have marked as fatal, and he saved them anyway. He operated on 3 patients at the same time, his hands on one while his voice guided 2 junior medics through procedures on the others. A hegemony observer who was sheltering in the med bay later reported that Calloway did not stop moving for the entire 4 hours. He did not sit down. He did not eat. He did not pause. He simply moved from one broken body to the next, stitching and sealing and refusing to let anyone die on his watch. And through all of it, Laura Beckett held the line. She made decisions that looked like madness on paper. The atmosphere from a damaged deck, creating a path of its own swarm. She vented atmosphere from a damaged deck, creating a pressure wave that deflected a volley of incoming torpedoes. She adjusted the ship's shield harmonics in real time, a technique that Drelith engineers had theorized about but never attempted. Because the calculations were too complex and the margin for error was too small, she did it by feel. Vrethak stood on the bridge and watched her, and he felt something crack open inside his understanding of what a living being was capable of. This was not training. This was not doctrine. This was something else, something that had no name in his language or any language he knew. It was a woman standing at the center of a dying ship, bleeding from a wound above her eye. are surrounded by fire and noise and death, and choosing moment by moment to hold everything together through nothing but will. The hegemony frigates fought hard. The Tasari cruiser fought hard. But it was the Carthage that held the center, and it was the Carthage that the Nivek could not break. 2 hours in, the hive carrier moved to engage the Carthage directly. It was 10 times the size of the human ship. And in the darkness, Vrethak heard Beckett's voice. "I'm coming to you," he said. "I'm coming to you." In the darkness, Vrethak heard Beckett's voice, calm and clear, say, "Harlow, target the carrier's signal node. Kimura, give me everything the reactor has left, all of it." The Carthage fired one shot, one single, desperate, a perfectly placed shot that hit the hive carrier's communication array and severed its link to the swarm. 200 Nivek combat units lost coordination at once. They scattered, collided, turned on each other. The swarm collapsed into chaos. When reinforcements arrived 4 hours and 11 minutes after the battle began, the Nivek were in full retreat. Moorhaven Station was damaged but intact. 40,000 civilians were alive. The Carthage was barely a ship anymore. Its hull was breached in 9 places. Weapons were at 12%. Life support was running on backup power. Half the corridors were open to vacuum, but the crew was alive. Every single one of them. Vrethak stood on the shattered bridge, surrounded by smoke and sparking wires and the sound of metal settling, and he looked at Captain Laura Beckett. She was standing. She was bleeding. Her uniform was burned, and she was still there. "How?" he asked. His voice broke on the word. And he did not care. She looked at him, and she smiled. It was tired, and it was small, and it was the most real thing he had ever seen. "We just don't know when to quit, Commander," she said. He stood there in the ruins of a ship that should have been a grave, and he believed her. The Battle of Moorhaven changed things in ways that no one predicted. Strategically, the Nivek had failed to destroy a civilian target, even with overwhelming numbers, and the ripple of that failure spread through their command structure like a crack in glass. The swarm was built on the idea that superior numbers always won. Moorhaven proved that idea wrong, and for a species driven by instinct and certainty, doubt was a poison with no cure. But the bigger change was not strategic. It was something softer, harder to measure, and far more powerful. The galaxy noticed the humans. Reports of the battle spread through Allied command channels first, and then through civilian networks, then through the independent media outlets that existed in the spaces between empires. The details varied depending on who was telling the story, but the core remained the same. A single human ship, small and outgunned, had placed itself between a swarm and a station full of strangers and had refused to move. 4 hours, 200 enemies, 40,000 lives saved. The Drelith talked about it in terms of tactical innovation. The Tasari talked about it in terms of courage. The smaller species, the ones who had always lived in the shadows of larger powers, talked about it in terms of something they had almost forgotten existed. They called it defiance. Not defiance against an enemy, but defiance against the idea that the weak must always fall. Vrethak wrote his 3rd report to the Hegemony War Council, and it was the longest document he had ever produced in his military career. He spent 6 days on it. Rewriting every paragraph multiple times, because the things he was trying to say did not fit neatly into the language of military assessment. He wrote that human endurance was not simply physical. Every species in the Alliance had physical toughness in some measure. The Drelith were stronger. The Tasari were faster. Several lesser-known species could survive conditions that would kill a human in minutes. But humans had something else. And something that operated on a level Vrethak could only describe as psychological and perhaps even spiritual. He wrote that humans did not merely resist destruction. They adapted to it in real time, changing their tactics, their tools, and even their own limits in the middle of a crisis. He had watched Grace Kimura rebuild critical systems using parts that were never designed for the purpose, inventing solutions on the spot that hegemony engineers later said should not have worked. And he had watched Danny Harlow find patterns in enemy behavior that no computer had flagged. Not because the data was hidden, but because no algorithm had ever been desperate enough to look where he looked. He had watched Pete Calloway save lives that were already lost, pulling people back from the edge through skill and stubbornness and an absolute refusal to accept the word impossible. He wrote that their creativity under pressure was not a skill that could be trained. It was something that emerged naturally from the way humans were built, from the collision of fear and love and anger and hope that lived inside every one of them at the same time. They did not shut down their emotions to fight. They used them. They burned hot where other species burned cold, and the heat did not destroy them. It forged them. He wrote the sentence that would be quoted in hegemony classrooms for generations. They do not defy reality. They simply refuse to accept the version of reality that says they should lose. The War Council debated the report for weeks. Some members dismissed it. They said Vreth-Ak had been among the humans too long, that he had lost his objectivity, that he was romanticizing a species that had simply gotten lucky in one battle. Others took it seriously, perhaps too seriously. There were quiet conversations in closed rooms about what it meant to ally with a species that did not recognize limits. Some voices asked whether humans were partners to be embraced or a force to be contained before it grew beyond control. Vreth-Ak was not invited to these conversations, but he heard about them, and they made him uneasy. Not because he feared for the humans. He feared for the hegemony. Because he had seen what the humans could do when they were fighting alongside you, and he did not want to imagine what they could do if you gave them a reason to fight against you. Meanwhile, as aboard the Carthage, life continued in the way that human life always seemed to continue, with a stubbornness that bordered on absurd. The ship was in dry dock for repairs, but Grace Kimura treated the process less like maintenance and more like resurrection. She moved through the damaged sections with her notebook in one hand and a welding torch in the other, humming old songs that she said her grandmother used to sing. And she rebuilt systems that the hegemony repair crews had written off as destroyed. She argued with their engineers, politely but firmly, and she was right more often than they were comfortable with. One hegemony technician later admitted that Kimura had taught him more about reactor mechanics in 2 weeks than he had learned in 4 years of formal training. Danny Harlow used the downtime to design new drills. They were harder than the old ones. The scenarios were more desperate. The margins thinner, the odds longer. When Vreth-Ak asked him if Moorhaven had not already proven that his crew could survive the impossible, Harlow looked at him with an expression that was equal parts amusement and something darker. "Moorhaven taught me where the real edges are," he said. "Now I know how far we can go, so I am going to push us further." Pete Calloway added no new cards to his collection after Moorhaven. He had not lost a single patient during the battle, not one. And he considered that the greatest achievement of his career. But he did not celebrate. He simply returned to his medbay, organized his supplies, and prepared for the next time. Because there was always a next time. And Captain Beckett wrote letters. She wrote one letter to every family on Moorhaven Station. 312 letters, each one written by hand, each one different. She did not use a template. She did not copy phrases or repeat sentiments. She sat at her desk in her quarters with a pen and paper, and she wrote to each family as though they were the only one. Vreth-Ak found out about the letters by accident. He passed her open door one evening and saw her at the desk, surrounded by pages, her hand moving slowly and steadily across the paper. He stood in the doorway and watched for a moment before she noticed him. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Writing to the families on Moorhaven," she said without stopping. "Nay, all of them." "All of them." He stepped into the room and looked at the pages. The handwriting was neat and careful, and even upside down he could see that each letter was long and detailed and personal. "They do not know you," he said. "They will never meet you. Most of them will never know which ship was responsible for their survival. Why do this?" Beckett set down her pen and looked at him. Her face was tired, the way it always was now, but her eyes were steady. That is not why you write letters, Commander," she said. He waited for her to explain. She did not. She picked up her pen and went back to writing, and he stood there for a long time, watching, trying to understand. He could not fully, but something about it stayed with him, like a note of music that hums in the chest long after the song is over. In the weeks that followed, requests came in from across the Alliance. Other species wanted human crew members on their ships. Not because of human technology, which was still modest by galactic standards. Not because of human numbers, which were still small. They wanted humans for something that could not be measured or manufactured. They wanted the quality that Vrethak had seen on the bridge of the Carthage, the quality he had eventually stopped trying to name and simply called the human thing. It was the way they got angry instead of afraid when the odds turned against them. It was the way they mourned their dead with real tears and real pain, and then stood up the next morning and went back to work. It was the way they treated every life they encountered, human or alien, familiar or strange, as though it mattered. As though every single person in the galaxy was someone worth fighting for. Vrethak had served alongside many species. He had respected many of them, but he had never encountered one that fought harder for strangers than for themselves, and that, more than anything else, was what he could not explain and could not forget. He sent a private message to the Hegemony War Council. It was short. It said, "Do not make enemies of these people. Whatever you do, do not give them a reason to stand against us. You will not like what happens." It was the most important advice he ever gave. Whether they listened was another matter entirely. The war against the Nivek swarm did not end with a single great battle. There was no final charge, and no dramatic last stand, no moment where the enemy fell and the galaxy cheered as one. It ended the way most wars end, slowly, painfully, and without the clean shape that stories prefer. The swarm retreated. It pulled back from system after system, not in panic, but in confusion, like an animal that had bitten into something it did not understand and could not swallow. The Allied fleet pressed forward, retaking stations and colonies and supply routes that had been lost months or years before. Yes, and with each victory, the swarm shrank a little more. Analysts credited superior logistics. Historians pointed to key battles and the strategic decisions that turned the tide. Politicians gave speeches and claimed foresight. Everyone had a theory about why the Alliance had won. Vrethak knew the truth, and it was simpler than any of them wanted to admit. The swarm broke because it met humans, not human weapons, which were adequate but unremarkable. Not human ships. Could not predict, could not outlast, and could not predict, could not outlast, and could not frighten into retreat. The Nivek operated on instinct and pattern. They consumed, they expanded, they overwhelmed. Their strength was in their certainty, in the absolute knowledge that enough numbers and enough pressure would break anything. It had always worked before. Every species they had faced had a breaking point, a moment where the pain became too much and the will cracked and the resistance collapsed. Humans did not have that moment. They bled. They screamed. They lost friends and wept for them and sat in dark rooms staring at walls. They felt every wound and carried every scar and remembered every face. But they did not break. They got up the next morning and they went back to their stations and they did it again. And the day after that, they did it again, and they would have done it forever because somewhere deep inside the machinery of what made them human was a gear that simply would not stop turning. The swarm could not understand that. And what the swarm could not understand, it could not defeat. The ceasefire was declared on a Tuesday by human reckoning. It meant nothing to the rest of the galaxy, which did not organize its time the way humans did, but the crew of the Carthage treated it as significant, and so Vrethok noted the day. He was standing on the observation deck when the announcement came through. The Carthage was docked at a repair station near the Tesserae border, and through the wide viewport he could see the Allied fleet arranged in the space beyond, ships of a dozen different species floating together in the quiet dark. The war was over. The galaxy was still here. It did not feel real. Grace Kimura found him first. She came up to the railing and leaned against it with her arms folded, looking out at the stars. She did not speak for a long time, and Vrethok did not rush her. He had learned that humans often needed silence before they could find the right words, and Kimura in particular used silence the way other people used paragraphs. "You know," she said finally, "I never actually thought we would make it." Vrethok turned to look at her. "You did not believe you would survive?" "Not really. Not after Moorhaven. I saw what we were up against, and I did the math, and the math said no. Every time I patched that ship back together, a part of me thought it would be the last time." "Then why did you fight so hard?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because probably not is not the same as definitely not. And that gap, that tiny little space between the two, that is where we live, Commander. That is where all of us live, every single day." She smiled at him, a small, tired, honest smile, and then she turned back to the stars. Danny Harlow came next. He walked up and stood on the other side of Vrethok, hands in his pockets, shoulders loose. He looked different than he had at the beginning of the war. The sharpness was still there, the readiness, the ability to assess a room in a single glance. But the grin was rarer now, and the spaces between his words were longer. He had been changed by what he had seen and done, not broken, but reshaped, like the way metal is reshaped by heat. He nodded at Vrethok, and Vrethok nodded back, and neither of them said a word. They did not need to. There was a language that existed between soldiers who had survived the same fire, and it had no words in it, and it was the most honest language in the galaxy. Pete Calloway arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Vrethok, who accepted it without complaint. He had learned to drink the bitter human beverage over the course of the campaign. And he did not enjoy it exactly, but he had come to associate its taste with the quiet moments between crises, the small human rituals that turned a metal box in space into something that felt like a home. Calloway stood beside him and said nothing. He did not need to. His presence was enough. It was always enough. The medic carried his silence the way he carried everything else, with care, with weight, and with the understanding that some things were too important for words. Vrethok noticed that Calloway's hands were empty except for the coffee. No cards, no laminated faces. He had added none after Moorhaven, and the war had not taken any more from him since. Whether that was luck or skill or something else, Vrethok did not know. But he saw the quiet pride in the medic's eyes, and he understood it. Captain Beckett was the last to arrive. She walked onto the observation deck with the same steady stride she used everywhere, or out at the fleet. For a long time, out at the fleet. For a long time, she said nothing. The stars turned slowly beyond the viewport. Ships drifted. Lights blinked in the dark. The galaxy breathed. Then she spoke. "Commander," she said, "I have been meaning to ask you something. That first report you sent about us, the one where you said we were unremarkable and would not contribute meaningfully to the campaign. Do you still believe that?" Vrethok felt something move in his chest. It was not embarrassment, though there was some of that. It was something larger. something that had been growing inside him since the day he had stepped aboard this ship and had been growing every day since. He thought about Moorhaven. He thought about the bridge on fire and the hull cracking open and the lights going out. Then he thought about the voice in the dark that said, "Give me everything the reactor has left." He thought about Kimura's notebook, filled with solutions to problems that had not happened yet, written by a woman who planned for the end of the world and then prevented it. He thought about Harlow's drills, the impossible ones, the ones that trained for the fights nobody was supposed to survive, because those were the ones that actually happened. He thought about Calloway's cards, and the faces of the dead carried not as a burden, but as a promise that their lives had mattered and their loss would not be wasted. He thought about 312 handwritten letters, each one different, each one real, written by a woman who would never meet the people she was writing to, because that was not why you wrote letters. He thought about a species that looked at the darkness between the stars and did not flinch, and a species that carried its grief and its hope in the same hands, and somehow found the strength to close those hands into fists when the galaxy demanded it. "No," he said. His voice was rough, and he let it be rough, because some words deserved the weight of the throat that carried them. "I was profoundly wrong. I have been a soldier for 40 years, and I have never been more wrong about anything in my life." Beckett looked at him, and she smiled. It was the same smile from the bridge at Moorhaven, tired and small and completely real. The kind of smile that did not perform for anyone but simply existed because the person behind it meant it. "Good," she said, "because we are just getting started." Vrethak looked out at the stars. The fleet was quiet. The war was over. The future was uncertain in the way that all futures are uncertain, full of dangers that had not yet shown their faces and problems that had not yet been named. But standing on the observation deck of a ship that had been broken and rebuilt so many times that none of the original hull remained, surrounded by 4 humans who had taught him more about war and life and courage than 40 years of combat ever had, he felt something he had never felt before. He felt hope. Not the hope of certainty, not the hope that comes from knowing you will win. It was a stranger, wilder thing than that. But it was the hope of a man who had seen the worst the galaxy could offer and had watched a small, stubborn, impossible species look at that worst and say no. Not with armies, not with superior firepower, not with grand strategies or ancient wisdom or the cold logic of survival. Just no. Simply, quietly, and without hesitation. No, not today, not tomorrow, not ever, as long as there is a single one of us left to stand. Vrethak drank his coffee. It was bitter and warm. Beside him, the humans stood together in the dark, looking out at the stars they had saved, and the silence between them was full of everything that mattered. The war had felt familiar to him once. Every war did, after a while. The shapes were the same. The patterns repeated. Victory and defeat, and the long, gray nothing in between. But the humans had changed that. They had taken the familiar shape of war and bent it into something new, something that Vrethak had no name for and suspected he never would. He finished his coffee and set the cup down and stood with them in the quiet, and he did not try to name it. Some things were better left unnamed, some things only needed to be felt. And he felt it, for the first time, and it was enough.